Hello, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 7 of the Virtual Coffee Podcast. I'm Bekah, and this is a podcast that features members of the Virtual Coffee community. Virtual Coffee is an intimate group of developers at all stages of their coding journey, and they're here on this podcast sharing their stories and what they've learned. And we're here to share it with you. Here with me today is my co-host, Dan.
Thanks, Bekah. Today we had a great time hanging out with Jessica Wilkins. Jessica is a self-taught developer and staff author for the freeCodeCamp news publication. Jessica talked about how to get started with tech writing, how to differentiate between constructive criticism and negative feedback, and how to avoid things like gatekeeping in your tech writing by eliminating assumptions about your audience and avoiding terms like "it's so easy" and "just do this." She gave some tips like adding prerequisites to your posts or other resources, and basically outlined her entire process for all of her tech writing that she does. And she does a lot of it, and it's all pretty awesome. It was a really great conversation, and I know you're going to enjoy it.
We start every episode of the podcast like we start every virtual coffee. We introduce ourselves with our name, where we're from, what we do, and a random check-in question. We hope you enjoy this episode. My name is Bekah. I am a front-end developer from a small town in Ohio, and my favorite childhood movie was Beauty and the Beast.
That's a good one. Hi, my name is Dan. I am a front-end developer from Cleveland, Ohio. And my favorite movie was Star Wars. I think if I had to pick one, it would be Return of the Jedi. As a child, I watched it. Well, just a lot. So it's an easy choice for me.
It's a solid choice.
Sounds pretty good. Hi, I am Jessica Wilkins, and I am a musician learning how to code. I am also a technical writer for freeCodeCamp News. And my favorite movie was actually the Toy Story movies. And so the original one, but all four of them are amazing there.
Nice. Those are on big rotation at our house with our kids. We also enjoy them.
I totally cried when Andy went to college. I bawled like a little baby. I'm like, oh my gosh, he can't leave. And then he was giving his toys to the little girl. I'm like, I'm getting teary-eyed now, you know?
Yeah, I actually try to discourage. That's Toy Story 3. I try to actually discourage Toy Story 3 just because it's very good. It is emotionally affecting.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
My oldest is 12, and he'll look at me and be like, "Are you crying?" Yes.
Like, it's very sad. We grew up with Andy.
Dude, entertainment, like, it takes on a whole new slant especially when you have kids, because like I just find myself being, affected by this stuff in different ways, and it's like, it's cool. It's good stuff.
It's been wild rereading novels I read as like a young adult to my kids. Because I always loved young adult fiction, and I always loved the young adult character, right? And now as a parent, when I read it, I identify with the parents in the novels, and I'm like, oh, they don't understand what they're doing to their parents. So yeah, it's very different. Lots of crying in young adult novel reading too.
Yeah. At some point I realized it with Calvin and Hobbes. I was a big Calvin and Hobbes fan growing up, and found myself recently, identifying much more with the parents. Anyway.
Welcome, Jessica. It's so great to have you here with us today, especially because we did a lunch and learn recently with Jessica, and we'll put the link to that in the show notes. And she did such a good job about talking us through writing and writing career. And it is our monthly challenge this month. Every month we hold a monthly challenge. Everybody in the community is welcome to do it. And this is the 1-year anniversary of when we started monthly challenges. And so it's one of my favorites. It's the blog writing challenge, and it's based off of NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month. And so Jessica is just an amazing writer. And we kicked off the blogging challenge, and our goal was to hit 50,000 words. That's what, as a community, that's what it was last year. We didn't quite make it. We almost made it. But this year, today is Tuesday, November 9th, we have already where are we at? We're past halfway.
I think we're
So,
at 27,000, I think. Yeah.
largely in part due to
Yep,
Jessica.
over 28,000. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Cool.
So I'm extra happy to have you here to talk about this challenge with us. But before we jump into that, we always like to get your origin story, and you have a awesome one. So tell us a little bit about how you got to this point in your career.
Yeah, it's definitely unique there. So I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in a town called Palm Springs, which is like 2 hours south of Los Angeles in California there. And grew up with a single mom who was a teacher. And so I got into music pretty early at 7 and then just kind of stuck with it. And pretty early on, I decided I'm going to be a professional musician. And so I started with piano, and then at 11, started learning the oboe, which is like a woodwind instrument. And I at first didn't really like it because I didn't sound that good at it.
Yeah.
But then I started to kind of get into it. I was like, okay, cool. So then I started doing like festivals and private lessons and all that fun stuff. And I decided at like 15, I'm going to try to go to music school or a conservatory and go down that route and be a classical professional musician. And so when I graduated from college or from high school, I went on to Eastman School of Music, which is in Rochester, New York, and studied there for 4 years on oboe performance. And then I graduated and went on to a master's at University of Michigan, which is in Ann Arbor. And then after that, I decided to come back to Southern California because the cold was just not agreeing with me. So after 6 years of really cold weather, I was like, nope, hard pass. Let's go back to Southern California. So I came back and decided that I wanted to start my own sheet music company and run
That's
that,
cool.
and then also perform and freelance. And so from 2015 to 2020, all I did was perform and record and run my sheet music company and teach. And so I was kind of busy with all that fun stuff. And then 2020 happened and everything changed. So for everybody, but for me, it was just, okay, go home and there's no work for you. And I'm like, great. So what am I supposed to do now? So I just worked on the business and tried to keep that going and afloat and changing there for a few months. But then in June of 2020, U.S. was going through a lot with COVID and then race relations with the George Floyd murder. And so a lot of people were talking about diversity issues within many industries, including myself, right? My industry with the classical world of operas and orchestras, because there's a huge diversity problem with Black representation, especially. And so people were asking me, like, can you give me information about composers I can learn about so we can start to change? And I decided there should be a website. Like, there should just be one place where people can find all this stuff. And I was like, well, maybe I could build it. I've never built anything. I've never coded before, but hey, we've got all this time. So maybe we'll learn and see what happens. So that's how I got into programming and been doing this for about a year and a half now. And yeah, so that's kind of my origin story and how I got into where I'm at now. So
That's so awesome. Does that site still exist out there?
yes, so I created version 1 about 6 months into my learning, and it's called the Black Excellence Music Project. And I built that with HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript. And then I revisited it a few months ago over the summer of 2021 and created version 2, which was built with React and Tailwind CSS and has more artists and more games and all of this fun stuff. And yeah, so this was always like a passion project. And so I got into tech not because I wanted to switch careers. I thought initially in June, I was like, oh, this thing will just blow over eventually and I go back to my old life. And that's obviously not what happened. I widely understood how like COVID works. I totally thought this was
Same.
just going to be like a
Everyone
couple
did.
of months there. And I was completely wrong. And then I ended up starting to get developer work, and that was kind of cool. And then I started writing for freeCodeCamp, which was also kind of cool. So, and I was like, well, maybe I can have a career there. So yeah.
That is so awesome. So, that project is an open source project, right?
Yes, yeah. And so it's available on my personal GitHub, but it's completely open source. And so anybody could like dive in there, and if they want to contribute there, I'm pretty open to that. So yeah.
That is really awesome. And again, those links will be in the show notes. And I just think you seem like so driven and motivated from everything that you've talked about. Your career as a musician, at 15 years old, you decided that you were going to do this thing. And that's not an easy thing. So you have this, I don't know, tenacity or something. How would you kind of describe that drivenness that's allowed you to go through these different things and accomplish so much?
I think that's in large part to both my mom and my grandmother. And so both of them were single parents. And so one was by choice. My mom worked as a teacher for many years, and then in her 40s decided that she wanted to adopt and have a child. And so she had me when she was like 44 or 45. And then with my grandmother, she was married, but it was unfortunately an abusive situation. So she had to get out and get to safety and raise two kids by herself, and was also a teacher. But then went on to, own land in certain parts of California and just be fiercely independent. And so I just kind of picked up on that, where if they decided they were going to do something, they just went for it. And so I just, growing up with that type of mindset and energy, it's like, well, I guess that's just what we do here. You just want to go do something. So when I discovered my love for operas and orchestra and this weird, beautiful instrument of the oboe, I was like, I want to go do that, and I want to go achieve that. And so I just went for it. And I definitely didn't think I was going to get into the conservatory I was, but it ended up working out, thankfully. But leading up to it, because I got four rejections, and then the last one was an exception into my dream school. So at first I was like, well, maybe I'm just not going to college
Mhm.
because I had four rejections from other
Wow.
schools. But then at the very end, I was accepted to Eastman, and that was the last school I heard back from. And I was like, okay, cool. I guess we're going, and we're going to my dream school. So that worked out.
That's awesome. Oh, the oboe is an interesting choice. What do you have any reason why, like, what made you like lean towards the oboe? I know from, I know it's very hard to learn and all that stuff. I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so I didn't actually choose it. My
Sure, that happens too.
I didn't choose it. Yeah. So I was learning piano in elementary school, and then I tried to pick up trumpet, but that definitely was not the right fit for me. I couldn't really make any type of sounds, but I wanted to be in band because all of my friends were in band, and I loved music. And so I asked the band director at the middle school, and I told him, I said, "Hey, I'm really passionate. I want to learn something." And his answer was, "You should learn the oboe." And I'm like, "Okay, what is that?" And he was like, "Here." And so he got out an oboe and he got out a reed and he put it together for me and he said, "Okay, this is how you blow, and this is how you make an embouchure." And I did that, and it squeaked. And he's like, "Perfect. You should be our new oboe player." I was like, okay, cool. And I'm like 11 years old, so I'm just game for anything. And he probably totally planned that. Like, yes, we got another one, because oboe's so rare in schools, along with like bassoon. And so that's probably when he heard that I just wanted to join. He's like, cool, let's just talk her into playing this thing, and we're all taken care of. But I guess I have to thank him for it, because I ended up falling in love with it. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I imagine there was no oboe player, before you started.
yeah, there was actually just one,
Oh, there is.
but
Yeah.
then he was like, "We really need one other one." And so it was easy to talk an 11-year-old, because at that age, you're just like, "I just wanna do anything," and you're not gonna, like, fight it there, so
My oldest is learning the trombone because someone gave us a free trombone. So,
see, there you go. Yeah, exactly. That's how, like, most kids fall into it. They're like, "I don't know, just give me an instrument. I'll figure it out."
yeah, that is awesome. And so it's great to hear too you've had this history of teaching in your family, and it sounds like you also taught music, but you're also teaching now through what you're doing. You did the lunch and learn for us and taught us all about writing, but also as you're writing, you're teaching. So, how much of that do you think that you're able to lean on what you've learned from your mom and your grandmother, or is it something that you thought you really had to work hard to acquire that skill?
Yeah, I really when I was teaching beginners, there's a lot of patience required when you're teaching beginner students, especially beginner oboists, because it's like a really weird instrument and there's not a lot of unnatural things with it. And so it requires a lot of patience and just saying, okay, let's just take it one step at a time. And so I think that translates a lot into the articles I write now. I write a lot of beginner articles on HTML and CSS and JavaScript and tutorials and all that fun stuff. And so I know what it's like to just first start out in programming. And I think a lot of writers just skip over stuff and they'll skip like 20 steps when they're writing about something. And they'll go, oh, yeah, first you do this. And then when you log in, just take care of this and then go over here. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like, how is a beginner supposed to kind of fill in those gaps? And so I really try to be conscious about explaining things, not assuming anything, being patient there. And so I think that goes into by writing, because I just want to help people as best as I can.
That's so important because it really helps to create a more welcoming and inclusive space in tech to have tutorials or guides or articles that don't make assumptions about the people who are reading them. Because I can't tell you how many times I started reading something and got very frustrated because I was following the steps, but it wasn't working and I didn't know what to do or what to look for. And that can be really hard to navigate through, especially if you're self taught or you don't have a good support system. So, I really appreciate hearing you talk about making sure that that's part of your process.
Mhm. Yeah, because it's just like the person came to learn, and so when you're just skipping steps or saying, "Oh," one of the things too that's a pet peeve is when people say, "Oh, it's so easy, you just do this." You can't say that. Like, a lot of people do this when they're setting up, like, GitHub for the first time, and they'll say, "Oh, yeah, you just set this up, and you just run these commands, just open up your terminal, it's totally fine, and there you go." It's like, "No, it's not totally fine." This is brand new for a lot of people, so you've gotta walk through those steps and throw in some screenshots and make sure that people can follow along. Because it might be easy for somebody that's been doing it for many, many years, but when you're first learning it, you're going, "Wait, where's my terminal? Where's my command prompt? How do I type this in first and then do this?" Or this is very confusing. So
Yeah, I'll
Do you,
never forget one of the first times I paired with somebody, it's somebody that I really like admired in the industry, and I was terrified because I didn't know. And at that point, I hadn't really been using VS Code or anything like that. And so they said, "Okay, can you open up a text editor?" And I had no idea what that word meant. And so I opened up Google Docs, and they like kind of went with it. And then eventually they were like, "Do you have something like VS Code or Atom?" And I was like, "Oh, that's a text editor." And like things like that, I didn't
right.
know. I hadn't seen it written before, and I was using built-in, um, things with the lessons that I was learning, and I remember just that, like, sense of shame that didn't belong there, right? I shouldn't be ashamed in that moment, but when you feel like there are assumptions like, "Oh, I should have known that," and it's not true, so to have people breaking things down to avoid that makes it much easier for people to keep learning.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, people want to learn, and I think writing is just such an important skill. I think everybody should write and work on writing. And I think there's just two levels. There's writing technical articles, and then there's also writing about your personal story. And so the cool thing about this monthly challenge is I get to do both. And so I get to focus on some technical stuff, and then I get to talk about some weird stories. And I have some fun articles coming up there, and just kind of sharing my story there.
yeah, I think that's awesome. That balance of you know, not making assumptions about your audience and um, but also still kind of getting your point across for the thing you're trying to learn is a hard balance to strike. And I think you do it well. Is there anything like if somebody was starting a technical article, I mean, wh- what advice would you give? Like if what, say the thing that I wanted to learn or that I wanted to, teach, had required GitHub, required you to check out a repository and all of that stuff. Would you say, like, would you suggest putting all that stuff step by step in, or linking to, articles about, about how to do that, or that kind of thing? Like what kind of approach, generally would you suggest?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's fine if if you want to link an article, or if you want to have it right at the very top of your article, just say prerequisites, must be familiar with Git and GitHub. I mean, I just wrote an article about how to work with Node and Node Mailer for emails. And so I had a prerequisite saying, okay, I'm not going to cover basic JavaScript. So it's important that you understand some of the basic concepts and the basics behind Node so we can dive straight into this. And there was one section where there's a different setup with how to do Google with Node Mailer and set up all the authentication there. And so I did link to another freeCodeCamp article and say, okay, here's a detailed step-by-step process if you're going to use Google with Node Mailer. Otherwise, you could walk through the steps that I'm going to show you here. So I think that's completely fine there. Or if you feel like you could write through all those steps in the article. I think either approach works there. But I think it's healthy to have like a prerequisites if necessary, just to let everybody know, hey, if you don't have these prerequisites, then it's going to be kind of hard to follow, especially for some of the tutorials. Because I see a lot of people on FreeCodeCamp go through a lot of our Python tutorials, which assume you have some basic knowledge, but they're not acknowledging that you have basic knowledge. And so they'll come to the forum and they'll go, how do I do this? Or why does it say I have an indentation error? And so we'll tell them, like, you're doing crazy things with your indentation. You can't do that in Python. But they won't know that because they just started coding Python like 2 days ago and they're trying to build like a Discord bot. And so just properly communicating, like, this is not necessarily a beginner, or if it is, like, here's some walkthrough steps that you can go through. Here's a great article that lays it out. So I think that's completely fine there.
Yeah, I love that. Prerequisites, is I think that's a great way to set expectations for for the article, right? And then that way you don't get down 3 paragraphs in and become totally lost. Assuming you read the prerequisites,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
I try to make
yeah,
it obvious, a heading,
yeah,
like, here you go.
right, right, yeah,
So if someone misses it, it's like, okay, well, I did try to warn you.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I think that's great advice. Yeah,
Yeah, I think too, it's almost a really good convention to build into something. So I could see um like software that hosts tech blogging, like tech blogging platforms. It'd be really nice if that was built in. So, what are the prerequisites? And then you can click the thing or you can add the thing. And then that way, everybody knows where they should look for, okay, this is what I need to know. I don't know those things. And it also puts it in the writer's mind that it makes it obvious to them to think about it makes it a deliberate decision to recognize who their audience is and what they should already know coming into this. So I think like from both perspectives, it would be really useful in helping us to have these conversations about what content is usable for different audiences.
Right. And then there's some tutorials where people label it beginner, but it clearly isn't beginner. I'm
That's
like,
another pet peeve.
I don't think beginners are, I wasn't doing that when I was first starting out. And so sometimes people really mislabel, which hurts beginners. And then they're going through it. They're like, well, how do I do this? I'm like, well, maybe we start off with something a little bit easier if that's okay. So yeah, so sometimes people, I think a lot of it has to do with they forget what it's like to be a beginner, or they
yes,
like rewrite history and they're like, oh, I was totally doing this when I was first learning in 6 months or a year. And it's like, no, you probably weren't. You probably just forgot that you weren't doing those types of things. Cause I mean, the first few months I was going through free code camp and going through the certifications, but I didn't understand how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript work together. I was just like, okay, there's these things like arrays and objects, but how do I make a web page? Like, I just didn't understand how everything connected. And so beginners, it's a lot of information and it's just like fire hose. And so you just have to make sure that you're not making assumptions going, oh yeah, you could totally do this when you're a beginner. And it's like, no, you gotta break that down there. That's definitely not a beginner tutorial. Let's label it intermediate at best there.
yeah, absolutely. And to your point about how people could forget, the what it feels like to be a beginner. From experience, it's very easy to forget that. It takes effort to remember that, and practice, I'm sure, it becomes
Right.
easier.
Right.
But yeah, it's hard sometimes to put yourself back in once you're a few years into a career, uh, to put yourself back into that spot, the like total utter confusion.
Right. Exactly.
Like I can remember it, if I make like, if I think about it, I can remember it, and I was in the same boat. I'm like, well, I'm writing HTML here. I'm like, and I was writing like PHP at the same time. Like I was like learning it all at the same time, and totally didn't understand how they all connected. And, somebody sent me a CSS file. He's like, here, instead of using whatever, use this. And I'm like, well, here's a bunch of black magic. I'm just going to drop into my, like, into my program. And apparently it works, it's yeah, it can be a hard thing to remember, but an important thing for sure.
So I want to back up a little bit because I feel like we missed this very important part of the story of you started learning to code and suddenly you're writing for Free Code Camp. Like that's not something little, right?
I
That's
totally glossed over that.
major
Yeah.
accomplishment. So I don't want to lose that. So tell us, how did that happen?
Yes, it's a crazy story, but that's kind of my life. But what ended up happening is around October of 2020, or actually September of 2020, I decided to join the FreeCodeCamp forum because, like a lot of self-taught developers, you kind of bounce around to different resources and then you try to find one that works. And so I did a few different things before FreeCodeCamp, but then I landed on FreeCodeCamp. I was like, I kind of like this. Okay, cool. So I started going through the first certification, which is on HTML and CSS and responsive design. And so I decided to just sign up for the forum. I was like, maybe I could connect with some beginners. That'd be kind of cool. And some other developers and just talk with them. And so I just thought I would just kind of hang in the background and maybe jump in once in a while. But I ended up jumping in a lot more and answering questions or just giving my perspective and sharing my story. And so after about a month of being on the forum, Quincy reached out to me and he was like, hey, you're super active. And what's your story? Let's talk. And so we set up a Google Meet and we talked for about like 45 minutes. And we just talked about his background coming from a teacher into tech and then my background with music. And he decided, he said, well, you should join our forum moderator team and start writing for Free Code Camp as a volunteer. And I was like, okay, I don't know what to write about because I've just been doing this for like 2 seconds. And he said, just share your story. And I'm like, oh, I could do that. That sounds fun. So I decided to just write a few posts about my story. So I wrote one. My first one was about what I enjoyed about being a beginner. And I wrote one article about the parallels between music and learning code and programming. And then that was noticed by Gatsby. And they were like, hey, we have this blog. And do you want to write and we'll pay you? I was like, yeah, that sounds fun to me. So then I wrote about imposter syndrome and how I dealt with it as a musician and how it, goes in with programming. And so now all of a sudden I start writing articles and just sharing my story. And after a few months of doing that, Quincy comes back to me and says, well, I've got another proposition for you. Do you want to start writing technical articles and we'll pay you per article? And I was like, I don't think I could do that. So originally I actually said no, very politely, because I just didn't think I could do that. Because at this point, this was like 6 months in. And around the same time, I had started my first developer job, but I was still kind of overwhelmed with that. I was working part time at this small company. And so I was like, I don't know if I'm qualified to, to write technical articles. Like, who's going to believe me? Because I don't know what I'm doing. And he said, well, I think you can. I think you're really good at just breaking down concepts and you could pick articles and that you feel comfortable with. And so he had this whole Trello board of topics, and I could just choose which ones I felt comfortable with. So I picked all the HTML, CSS ones, and I think maybe a couple of JavaScript ones, and just started from there. And so a few months of just writing and getting paid per article on my own schedule. And around July was interesting because I was deciding if I actually wanted this to be a full-time career or not. And an opportunity came up with Disney for a music job, but I ended up turning that down to pursue software.
Wow.
And yeah, which is a whole other story in and of itself, but which we could cover. But yeah, and so then I was like, okay, well, I guess we're going into software now since I turned down that job. And then Quincy reached out again and said, hey, I've got a job for you. I want you to join my team officially and be writing all the time. I was like, okay, cool. So it's funny how life works out where one door closes and then another one opens. So around I started officially in August of 2021 writing articles and being part of the author team. And so there's a total of 4 of us, and we all come from very diverse backgrounds, and we're located all around the world. But he'll now assign us articles, and so he'll send us like 10 or 12 different headlines at a time, and then we just write. Basically, we research and write. So right now, I have a whole bunch of SQL articles, and I've been learning about that and just writing about SQL basically, as well as a few more JavaScript articles that I have left over that I need to write about. But yeah, that's kind of my story, my
Uh,
weird story, how I wound up at freeCodeCamp.
Best
oh,
story.
that's great. Yeah, and you actually answered at the end a question I was going to ask was, how to balance, like, if writing is your main job, how to balance actually learning whilst writing. But it sounds like that's kind of built into the job, right?
Exactly,
That's
yeah,
very
because
cool.
there's times where I'll get assigned articles, I'm like, "Okay, I feel comfortable about this," and then there's times where I'm like, "I've never really worked with this, so I guess I'll have to learn it." And because I have to write
Mm.
about it and convince people that I know what I'm talking about there. But it's really great because I get to we all have that, where we are asked to one of the authors was asked to learn, some PHP, write some PHP articles, another one was asked to write on C++ and learn that. And so we're all down for just learning whatever we need to learn and get the job done there.
Ugh,
I love
that's
that so
awesome.
much. Sorry, go ahead.
That was my whole thing. That was awesome. That sounds awesome.
Well, I just like kind of want to sum up your whole timeline here of everything that's happened because I think that for a lot of people that we talk to, especially people who are trying to transition into a tech career, it's where to get start. And first of all, like get comfortable with being uncomfortable, but also you- finding that spot. You had this opportunity because you participated on Free Code Camp because they reached out to you because they saw like, look, Jessica is awesome and she's here and she's contributing. And that just progressively led to more and bigger and better things. And so, start with telling your story and writing those words. And this is, that's largely been my blogging experience. I rarely write very technical things because I just want to get the words out on paper or it's not on paper, but put it out there into the world and that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, there's everybody has a story and everybody has something to talk about and share, and so just share with people, and you'd be surprised who reaches out. I mean, that's how I got my first developer job. I wasn't looking for a job. I didn't think I was anywhere close to being ready, but this guy found me on the forum. He's like, "Hey, I'm looking for a junior," and I'm like, "A junior in what? Like, you want me to write code for you?" And so he's like, "Yeah," and I still work with him to this day, and it's been an incredible learning experience. But that came out of just being active on the forum and just writing and talking about my story there.
Sorry, I was like, my brain is split in 2 different directions of where to go here. Dan, did you wanna add something before I take us off on a tangent?
Nope. Nope. I'd say pick the left one.
The left one. Okay, my left one was, thinking about your and literally in my mind, it was on the left. Um, your career goals. I don't know if you have career goals, but is writing something that you wanna continue to do? Do you wanna pursue, the writing aspect of coding or find yourself somewhere in the middle or just see this as, part of a tangent of your journey?
Yeah, yeah. I would like to have at one point a traditional like full-time developer job, but I definitely still want to keep writing. And so if there's any way I can still be involved, especially with Free Code Camp, and still write articles for them in some sort of capacity. Cause I love to write and I love to just teach people and help out wherever I can. But I think the bigger career goal too is I have all these ideas for music related tech that I want to build, and some of them are crazy ideas. And I mean, I guess all of my ideas are crazy,
Those
but
are my
I,
favorite.
I guess that's the entrepreneurship in me, where it's like all my ideas are insane, but I just don't want to
Those,
let them go. And
those the
so
best ones.
exactly. So yeah, so that's like the long-term goal, is to just start slowly tackling some of these ideas and just kind of go from there and work a regular developer job, but then also keep writing and just have fun with it.
Yeah, that gives me an idea for a monthly challenge because I think we have a big energy channel in Slack, and a lot of it is just GIFs um, to bring us big energy. But I really think that so many of us have these big ideas that we think are unattainable, or this is too big, or this is too out there, right? Or there's just too many of them to like focus on one. But if there was a big idea month, right? Like we all write down all of our big ideas if we want to share them and work together to kind of get feedback on those big ideas and figure out like where to focus or how to break things down. And then, that way, like together we have that support, but we're making progress on the things that we really enjoy doing.
Exactly. I mean, I think ideas are fun, and playing around with them and then trying to implement them. And sometimes people will call you crazy. I mean, people thought I was nuts to try to do a publishing company. I remember I went to an alumni event and I was just started with the business. And you go around at those events and you talk to, small groups of people. And it was some sort of administrator with the University of Rochester. And she was asking me what my next plans were. I said, well, I just moved here to LA and looking for freelance work, but I also have this sheet music business that I just got started. She's like, why? I'm like, oh, okay, well, let me tell you why. So I was a little taken aback. I was like, okay, great. Well, this conversation won't last long. But so I had a few people there just like, why would you do that? But I just had a very specific vision of what I wanted with my sheet music business. And then people were surprised that it actually turned into a business. I'm like, well, yeah, I told you I was going to do that. And you didn't believe me. And so, yeah, I think sometimes people will just reject it. And then once they see it come true, and they're like, oh, okay, I see it there. I mean, the same thing happened with Disney, where people thought he was nuts to build a park in Anaheim where all these orange trees were. And then obviously that worked out for him. But initially people thought he was just completely nuts. Like, who's going to go to this park and where is Anaheim? And well, people were wrong there.
Well, I love the confidence that you talk about it with too. You're like, yeah, I'm gonna do this thing because I want to do it and it's a good idea. And at some point, people start to buy into that idea because of how you present it and the confidence that you use. And oh, you're just like, I love how chill you are when you talk about things. I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, I would definitely work with Jessica on that. Like,
I just like going for things. It's like, either it works out or it doesn't. If it doesn't work out, I learned something. I had plenty of things that didn't work out, but I'm glad I tried it so I can at least learn along the way. But sometimes you just got to go for it. You can't really play safe, and you don't want to do too risky. You don't want to go like bankrupt or anything crazy. But like, you just want to. If you have an idea and you feel really confident about it, just go for it and take it one step at a time there.
Yeah, it's a theme that's come up a few times on the podcast. So, it makes me think of structured YOLO, Nick Taylor, which is a phrase he coined, but it's the same sort of idea, right? I mean, uh, you don't want to go full YOLO, right? But
Exactly.
a
Yeah, we don't
structured
want to go
YOLO, yeah,
all the way out there. I
yeah,
mean, like
still,
with my
still a little bit of
business,
yellow.
yeah,
yeah,
with my business, I wasn't like, okay, cool, let's just raise all this money. No, that would have been crazy because I was a young 20-something year old that didn't know what we were doing. So I had to take small little steps to get there. I couldn't go that big and do some crazy fundraising goal or whatever when I had no clue what I was doing. So
yeah, absolutely. But the willingness to have an idea that is not whatever normal, I guess, whenever, an idea that you might run into that conversation of somebody's like, well, why are you doing that? But the willingness to, jump into it, and then push through, I think is a, a valuable trait to have, and obviously it's served you really well.
So sometimes it can be really challenging to write blog posts, to get started, and to receive feedback on blog posts, whether that's from an editor or somebody who has commented on your posts in a way that is not um, kind. So, how do you navigate those challenging situations while you're writing?
Yeah, feedback is always interesting, especially in the world of the internet, because people can just hide behind their computers and say virtually anything to you that they probably wouldn't say if you were like face to face with them. But I try to just separate them between actual constructive feedback versus, okay, this is not helpful, I'm just gonna move on. And so I've had some constructive feedback like, oh, this is really good, and could you like expand on this part, or could you talk more about this? And I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then there's been times where it's like, well, I think it would be better if you went into this. I mean, that's what real developers do or whatever. So I've got like those comments. I'm like, okay, well, you're obviously not helpful. And so I just learned that when I was running my business that there's just those comments that people just have to just write things, and you're just like, okay, I'm just not going to waste my energy on that. And so luckily I haven't had too many just absolutely horrific things, at least with my programming writing. There was only one incident that I had when I was running my sheet music company, where there was this guy that went out of his way to make accounts and post racist memes and stuff on my page and on my YouTube channel. And I, of course, had to block all that. But he would keep creating new accounts. I'm like, you're that threatened by what I'm doing that you have to spend time. And so there are people out there that just are that hateful, that you just exist because of your race or your gender. And it's just like, okay, it's okay to be human and like, feel that and go, well, come on, but at the end of the day, you just have to remember, like, that's their issue, right? They're just a hateful person, and so you just try to block them and move on, and just focus on the helpful, constructive feedback as well as the positive feedback to know that you're on the right track, you're doing the right thing there.
Yeah, I really like that. And that's for a long time, I stayed away from blogging on any platform except my own blog because I didn't have comments enabled. I couldn't see how many people liked it, and I still frequently think about going back to that rather than cross posting other places that have those built-in things because sometimes it can be hard or you put a lot of time and effort into something and maybe two people like it versus the thing that I YOLO'd on a Saturday night and then there's all of these hits and like what is this? Um
Yeah, I've been there so many times, both with like writing technical articles and then with sheet music, where I'll release a new product and I'll be like, "Oh, this is gonna totally sell through. This is gonna be a hit," and then the sales are like nothing. I'm like, "Okay, wildly misjudged that." And then I'll release another product that I'm like, "Okay, this will do okay," and then it ends up being a breakout. I'm like, what happened? What how did I misjudge that? It's the same thing with writing where there'll be some articles. Actually, this just happened with the CodePen and Replit articles, because I decided to write those because FreeCodeCamp uses both of those tools in their certifications. And I thought there really should be a guide to help them since it's based on the course. And I just thought, okay, well, a few people write these. Hopefully they'll just refer to them. But then both of them were retweeted by the co-founders and the
yes.
CEO. And I'm like, okay, that was unexpected, but that's kind of cool.
Do you ever find yourself like doing tech support in comments, sections when you're writing technical
Sometimes I
articles?
do. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes someone's like, "Oh, I tried this example from your article. It's not working." And I'm like, "Oh, could you write the code?" And sometimes it's hard because on like Twitter and stuff, it's not really good for writing code. But I'm like, I don't know, just try your best or take a picture or something. And then I'll say, "Oh, you have this syntax error right here. If you clean that up, then you should be good to go." And so I've sometimes just kind of, or actually, this just happened too with the Node Mailer article where they're like, "Oh, could you put this up on a GitHub repo so we could study it?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I should totally do that," because I had just posted the final code in the article, and without thinking, like people would want to study it and fork it and all this fun stuff. I was like, "Oh yeah, we should probably do that." So I created a GitHub repository and then just shared it with them. But sometimes I'll kind of troubleshoot with them as best as possible. But then sometimes if like questions are vague. I'm like, I'm not really sure what you're working with, and unless we like get together on some sort of Zoom meet, but I don't know how like feasible that is. But yeah,
Yeah, that doesn't scale well, I think.
What about, so you mentioned like code examples and stuff like that. What kind of, I don't know, process, or I guess I'm looking for advice generally. Like if your article involves a lot of code, stuff like that, do you try to like break things up into little bits, or make a link to a repository, like like you mentioned? What kind of approaches do you take with technical articles and code
yeah,
examples?
yeah. So for some of the examples, they're really small. Like I just wrote one about JavaScript contains or includes method, and so those were like really really small code examples in there. But then one of my other articles was on the MVC pattern, and so I kind of had to struggle with how much code am I going to include in this because I built an app specifically to talk about that pattern. But I thought,
Mhm.
okay, is this going to be a full walkthrough tutorial or am I just going to give out chunks of it? So it ended up working where I said, okay, it's fine if they don't work with that particular stack that I was working with, and I was working with the merge stack. But if I could just talk about the concepts and just have a few snippets of code and say, this is what this code does, even if you're not a JavaScript developer, at least there's some context. And I had the final project there that they can look at and say, "Oh, okay, that's what she's doing here." And so sometimes you just want to have like these small little code examples. Sometimes it's totally fine to just link to a repository if it's super super long. Because then there's that battle between length, and it's like, how much are people really gonna read if it's super super long? There's not too many really long articles on Free Code Camp. There's a few that are like at 7,000 plus words. I personally haven't written any of those, but I think my longest was like 20, or no, I think my longest was 3,000, but that ended up just listing off all the types of like free courses you could take. But yeah, I try to hit that magic mark of like 1,500, 1,000 words or less. I mean, if there's only so much you can write about some of these methods where it's like, I can't write 1,500 words on the includes method for JavaScript. There's only so much you can do there. Yeah.
No, that's a good note. I mean, and that's also an interesting thing to like keep track of. When you're writing, do you, if you feel yourself getting like too long, do you try to cut it down, or do you think about splitting it up? I suppose this depends on what platform you're on or whatever. If you're writing for
Yeah.
FreeCodeCamp or not, or but just
Right,
generally,
right. Because 'Cause I'm
you know,
I just joined Dev2 like a week ago. Or I think I joined a while ago for Nick's VS Code tips and then just hadn't used it for a while, and then like rejoined, I guess. And for the note mailer article, I was like, okay, well, I have these ideas about how to style the emails and how to actually, deploy it to Heroku, but maybe we could just break that up. That could be a separate article. And I like how in Dev2, you can link to like create your own little series and it will link all the
Mm.
articles together. So sometimes when you're writing something, you're like, huh, I have these other ideas. Maybe it could be like, this is part one, and then this is part two, and stick around for part three or something. I think that's totally fine, just so it doesn't become this monster article. It's like, I don't know if everybody. It's the same thing with videos. I think some of the videos are super long on some of these
yeah.
channels where I'm like, is somebody going to sit through 17 hours? Or is that one of those things where you just got to break it up into smaller bite-sized videos? But I guess everybody has their own learning method. So maybe there are people that will go through a 17-hour video or,
My husband used to
7,000.
live stream for Free Code Camp, and sometimes he would do it for hours, and people would stay the whole
Oh
time.
yeah. Yeah. There's
And, like,
some like, yeah, I'm just like, wow, how?
I just live streamed for an hour for the
Right.
first time ever, probably by myself, and I was tired of hearing myself talk. Like, I can't imagine how everybody else was feeling, like,
Right.
my attention span starts to die, and then I start yellowing things, and it's not the place I wanna be.
Right, right. Actually, that reminds me, Danny Thompson is one where he has these really long Twitter spaces, but they're really good. So that's why he kind of is able to get away with that because, like, for most people, they would kind of die off after like at 45 minutes or an hour. Sometimes he'll go for like 3 hours or longer, and then there's still like hundreds of people there. And I'm just like, wow, that's kudos to him there.
I feel like you need voice training for something, like even talking, even when I used to teach night classes, like 3 hours of having conversation. And by the end, my throat hurts, and like I am done. I did know a teacher who was taking voice classes for that reason because they were saying it's how you're using your voice and you have to do it in this different way and then you'll be fine and exercise your muscle. Like, ugh, I don't. That's a lot. I mean, I think it's the same thing for writing too. It's a muscle that you have to exercise. So I imagine, I mean, you're writing on a lot of new topics all the time and learning things, but has the writing process gotten easier?
Yeah. I now have more of like a game plan on how I'm going to enter into an article. And so I usually like to start off with just a little introductory paragraph, knowing I'm probably going to edit it later on, but I just throw something up and then I get into the meat of the article and kind of flesh it out. And then once I clean up the actual main part, then I can go through and come up with a really good introductory paragraph and a conclusion there. I try to focus all of my attention just writing the main parts. And sometimes I just do like a free write where I'll just throw words on the page and some of them make it, some of them, I cut out sections. I'm like, I don't know what this was. I mean, that just happened with an article a few weeks ago on how to create tables in SQL. And some of those sections I'm like, why this doesn't make any sense. I don't know why I thought this was relevant, but I was just throwing words on the page. I'm like, oh, I should talk about this. And then I read it back. I'm like, no, I shouldn't have talked about that. But that's an easier approach to kind of cut things out there and then just reshape it into something acceptable that I can send to the editor. And she doesn't have to look at it and go, what is this?
One of the benefits of the writing medium, right, is this is easier to go back and and take things out that don't make sense,
Exactly. Yeah.
as opposed to maybe a live stream or something like that. The things
Well,
just get
I
out
mean,
there.
that's the expectation of live streaming. So it's
No,
like
for
a
sure.
built-in acceptable thing. Um, I can't remember what I was gonna say. Oh, I know what I was gonna say. Um, rough drafts are so important. I think that it's worth it to point out that there's a process that you get better at that process and you have a rough draft. Nobody puts out a perfect rough draft, a perfect draft the first time. It is a process and it does take time, but just listening to you talk about tech, Jessica, you communicate it so well that it's really, I feel like I've learned a lot just hearing you talk about these things. And so you can really appreciate that process of learning and how it impacts the way that you talk about things. And I imagine it that goes into interviewing and stuff like that, because if you talk with credibility, then people are more likely to see you as a credible person.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that you want to come across as how can I add value to the company or organization? If you come across as I just really need a job, well, the company's not really hiring you because you need a job. Like they're hiring you because they need people to join their team and add value. And so if you come in and say, "Here's how I can add value to you," then they'll listen. And so I think that just coming in with a little bit of confidence will go a long way there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're at about time here, but are there any last tips that you have for our listeners about getting started with writing?
I think just the best tip is just get started. I think a lot of people procrastinate because they're like, I don't know what to write about, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to get started. Just get started and just start working from there. And you can always ask for feedback within your community and say, hey, I'm writing this article. I don't know how it really works yet, or it needs some help. But don't wait for the perfect moment to get started writing. Just start writing, just start throwing some words on the page, start creating an outline, and then you can shape it and edit it down from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. This is really great to hear you talk about this and your journey. You have so many fascinating things, and I'm really glad that we got to hear them today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate it.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Virtual Coffee Podcast. This episode was produced by Dan Ott and Bekah Harrod Weigel and was edited by Andy Bonjour at Good Day Communications. If you have questions or comments, you can hit us up on Twitter at virtualcoffee.io or email us at podcast@virtualcoffee.io. You can find the show notes, sign up for our newsletter, check out any of our other resources on our website at virtualcoffee.io. And of course, join us for our virtual coffee chats every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Eastern and Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. Please subscribe to our podcast and be sure to leave us a review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.